Hey, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Peyton Cook, and I teach the Sunday drawing classes at the Ann Arbor District Library, which is a class that's a partnership between the library and the Ann Arbor Art Center located downtown. During these times, we are doing our class online in these video series, so I hope you are enjoying them. Today, we are going to be talking about landscapes, and I'm going to do a drawing in a bit, but first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about a few different concepts and different styles and approaches to creating a landscape before really getting into the process of actually drawing out the whole thing. So one of the things I think is most important, no matter what kind of style that you are making your landscape, the key thing I believe is atmospheric perspective. Now, there's a lot of great artists that don't really take into consideration atmospheric perspective, but I do think it's really a neat thing to include. And the idea is basically that your objects that are in the background are a lot less detailed. They're going to be duller and cooler colors, and the objects in the background will be blurry. The objects in the foreground, however, will be more detailed, more saturated with color, and the colors appear to be warmer. So it's not that the colors actually change depending on the location of where they're at. It's just the way that colors can change depending on how far away, or the way we see colors, depending on how far away we are from the actual colors. So it's a really cool thing to consider including in your artwork, especially in terms of color. But you don't have to use color. You can use whatever materials that you have on hand to do this project. I would really just take advantage of this beautiful weather we've been having. I'm actually sitting outside right now as I'm recording this, and if you hear some background noise, that's what that is. And it's a beautiful day, and so I would grab your art supplies, head outside if possible, and just enjoy being out there and drawing. So when you are outside, or if you're looking at a photo that you took at some point, here's some tips for a nice composition. So, it kind of sounds simple, but if it's pleasing to your eye, it's probably going to be pleasing as a landscape. If you're looking at it and you're like, yeah, this looks nice, then it's probably going to look nice on paper as well. Make sure that you overlap the elements and make sure that they sit on planes correctly. Apply the proper perspective. So let's say I'm sitting here and there's a tree right in front of me, and there's also a tree behind that. Making sure that the tree that's in front of me, directly in front, is probably going to be a little bit larger than the one that's behind it, and the same for the one that's behind that one. And so really applying the proper scale and perspective is going to be really important, but also letting things overlap. So those things that are covering up something behind it, let that happen. Let that layering really happen. It adds a lot of depth. And then adjust the horizon line for interest. This is one of my favorite things, yet something I'm really challenged by often, is adjusting that horizon line for interest. A lot of people gravitate, including myself, towards putting that horizon line smack down the center of your paper. So think about, what if you made it a little bit lower or a little bit higher, depending on where you want your emphasis to be. Okay? And also, you don't have to have your paper horizontally, though that's what we traditionally think of when we think of a landscape, but you can also make it more portrait style, going more vertically. So that would be another interesting thing to do. And then in addition, I would encourage you to zoom in and crop your image in on a specific part. You don't have to include the whole landscape. Look for a part that you really want your focal point to be and decide to emphasize that part. Make sure that you're also looking at contrast. So in the foreground with our atmospheric perspective, that also tells us we have a lot more contrast. We're going to see more darks and lights, and every variation between the two, more in the foreground than in the background. So making sure that when you apply your contrast, you're really putting more contrast into the foreground. And you can actually use your eraser to pull out some highlights if you want, depending on, of course, what medium you're using. If you're painting, that's not really going to help you very much, but if you are drawing with charcoal or Conte or graphite, then your eraser can be a really great tool for bringing out highlights. So as I mentioned, you can approach drawing a landscape in several different ways. So we're going to first just go over a more abstract landscape, which if you're familiar with my art, Here lately anyway, that is what I have been doing a lot of, is much more abstracted kind of landscapes, and that is what I'm going to show you today because, or to start with today, because I want those of you that feel discouraged or intimidated by drawing a landscape to just kind of relax for a second and take in the fact that you can create a landscape in whatever style you want, and just enjoy the process. Sit outside or sit at your desk or wherever you want to be to make art today is going to be just fine and perfect. But if you do it more in an abstract kind of style like this, then you're just looking a lot at the values. So you're looking at the darks, for example, on going ahead and layering in the darks, and then not really getting too caught up in the detail of the leaves, right? Like those look like trees back there, sort of, but you don't really see each individual leaf drawn out, and you don't see much texture really at all. There's just a few pretty nice little lines drawn in there, but lots of smudges and just lots of shading. These are even more extreme. Here we really just see your darkest darks and your lightest lights and very few midtones in between. It's more of the shape that the different elements included in the landscape create, and just letting that kind of speak for itself. So then I'm just quickly going to go over a more naturalistic approach. So for those of you that are more detail oriented and want to hone in on some more realistic drawing skills of really rendering and shading, these are some examples of how that would look. So much more realistic, much more detailed. It would be obviously a little bit more of a time-consuming process and getting in all of these details, but very worthwhile if that's something that you want to do. I think it's really important to learn some realism for sure. So, but whatever appeals to you is what you should definitely try out. Whatever would make you want to draw more, whatever would challenge you, however you want to go about this will be just fine. I'm going to do an example real quick, and I'm going to go over some of these same kind of concepts and talk a little bit more about how we create a landscape here. But I'm just going to I'm going to focus more on the drawing part of it, so that those of you that really want to focus more on the drawing end, that it suits you. But then I'm also going to add just a little bit of color, not anything too detailed, afterwards, so that those of you that want to try painting it, or however you want to do it, I think it will also work for you as well. So to start, you're just going to need a pencil and paper, and later you can color it or paint it however you want. First, I want to describe the parts of the landscape. In the front here, towards the bottom of the paper, we see the foreground. In the middle, where the water is, that's where the midground is. And then the background is where we see those trees. We call the line where the sky meets the ground the horizon line. I forgot to mention also that that tree is in the foreground. So objects that are in the foreground are going to be largest and biggest because they're here in the front. So if you were standing in this space, they would be right here in the front, whereas objects in the background, such as the trees, are really far away, and so they're pretty small. So even though we know those trees in the background are probably just as tall as this tree in the front, because they're so far away in the background, it appears to be smaller. The first step is to draw that horizon line about halfway or so up your paper. You can make it bumpy or straight. Then you're going to draw the tree. So that tree I'm going to draw, I want that to be one of the first things that I draw because it's in the front, so it's going to cover up some of the things that is behind it. So you can see that I'm adding lots of different tree branches. I'm making them really curvy. It's kind of a loose sketch right now. I'll color it in later and define it better as I go along, but for now I just want to get in the detail of all of the little branches, making sure that they're overlapping and crisscrossing, and just have a lot of really small ones and also some thick ones. You can also notice that those little small ones, they get smaller and smaller as they get further and further away from that tree trunk. I'm also adding a little bit of shading here, and also some grass at the bottom beneath the tree. I also want to add in some other details right below it just while I'm over here. I might as well go ahead and do that. So I'm adding in some loose flowers. Feel free to spend more detail on these, or you could add a whole garden down there, lots of different flowers. I'm just gonna add in some loose grass. And I'm gonna go ahead and map out now my mid-ground little pond that I have there, that little body of water. And then I'm just adding a little small bench that is overlooking the water. In the background, you can see I'm adding tall pine trees. Again, they're really small because they're in the background. They're further away from the viewer if you were standing in this space. So that's why they look pretty small in comparison to my tree in the front. So this is really a basic sketch of how to draw a landscape. From here, we can add other details. Of course, you can color it in. Again, you could use colored pencils for this, crayons, watercolor paint, acrylic paint. You could use markers if you want, though I do encourage you to practice some shading and adding some fun textures, which sometimes can be a little bit more challenging to do with markers. You can see here I'm adding a little bit more detail in my foreground. The objects that are in the foreground, whether it's a tree or a bench or a bird, something like that, it's always going to be a little bit more detailed than the objects that are in the background. So you can still add some detail to things that are in the background, but whatever is in the foreground generally should have more detail than the objects in the background. Also, you usually will see warmer colors such as red, orange, yellow, or the colors that you have will bring out warmer colors in the foreground, and then you'll see cooler colors in the backgrounds. That's why I'm adding more of a yellow, green, and also some browns into my foreground here. Now I'm just adding a little bit more detail in my background, adding some shadows. So you can still add some detail again, but just make sure that you have a little bit more detail and warmer colors in the front. Now I'm going to add some clouds in the sky. I want to make them nice and fluffy because it just looks like a beautiful spring day outside. I'm also adding in some yellow creamy colors into the sky, so you can see that as well, just to give it a little bit more texture and dimension. And then I'm adding in some leaves into the tree. So you can see how I'm putting this leaf pattern now all over the trees. I want to give the tree a lot of depth as well, so I'm not just going to do a dark green color. I'm also going to layer in some lighter greens as well. So there we have our landscape. So here in the front, again, that's called our foreground. In the middle there, near the bench, is our midground. Those tiny trees and tiny clouds back there in the far back, that's called the background. And then that line where we see the sky meet the ground is called the horizon line. So keep adding more details and have fun with this one.